March 24, 1944. Stalag Luft III, Sagan, Lower Silesia. The morning air carried the smell of pine resin and damp earth. Beneath Hut 104, 76 men crawled through a tunnel 300 feet long and 28 feet deep. The wood-shored passage, barely wide enough for shoulders, had taken 11 months to dig. They called it hairy. Flight Lieutenant Robert McBride pressed his face against the cold soil, pulling himself forward on his elbows. The air tasted of dirt and sweat and the fat lamp smoke that lit the tunnel in weak, flickering intervals. Behind him, someone whispered a prayer in Polish. Ahead, silence stretched like a held breath. The tunnel had been precision work. Engineers, architects, surveyors, all prisoners, had calculated angles and drainage, reinforced walls with bed slats, fashioned air pumps from tin cans and leather. They had dispersed tons of yellow sand into compound gardens, packing it beneath floorboards, scattering it in exercise yards. 600 men had contributed labor. Tonight, 200 were scheduled to escape. But the tunnel broke surface 15 feet short of the tree line. Instead of darkness and forest cover, the exit opened into moonlit clearing, directly visible to the goon box 20 yards away. The guard inside, bundled against the cold, stamped his feet and blew into his hands. His rifle hung from one shoulder. McBride froze at the tunnel mouth, watching the sentry's breath cloud in the March air. The plan called for men to emerge every 3 minutes, timed to the guard's patrol pattern. But the guard wasn't moving. He stood still, facing the forest as if waiting for something. The first man out would be visible for 10 seconds crossing to the trees. 10 seconds in full view. 10 seconds that could end the escape before it began. Roger Bushell, the mastermind behind the tunnel, had anticipated many problems. Cave-ins, discovery, tunnel flooding. He had not anticipated this. Neither had the 199 men still waiting underground, packed into the tunnel and the hut above, listening to the clock measure each lost minute. McBride could hear the guard's boots scraping ice. Could see his profile against the guard tower's weak light. The man looked young, maybe 20. Probably conscripted from some farm in Bavaria or Prussia, now standing night watch over enemy airmen while the war ground through its 5th year. The German military police, the Gestapo, the SS, they were known quantities. Brutal, efficient, predictable in their cruelty. But individual guards varied. Some enjoyed their power. Others carried out duty with mechanical indifference. A few showed flickers of something else. Boredom, weariness, silent disagreement with a war that had stopped making sense. This guard seemed none of those things. He seemed alert, purposeful, as if he knew exactly where he was looking and why. Flight Lieutenant Bernard Green, waiting behind McBride in the tunnel, whispered urgently. "What's the hold-up?" "Guard stationary. Wrong position." "For how long?" 5 minutes. Maybe longer. Behind them, the tunnel stretched back like a grave. Men packed shoulder to shoulder in the darkness, unable to turn around, unable to retreat. The air grew thinner with each passing minute. Someone coughed, the sound muffled but distinct. Another voice hissed for silence. Time became elastic. Seconds stretched into hours. The guard remained motionless. The moon tracked slowly across the sky. And McBride, watching through a gap barely wider than his fist, began to understand that something was wrong. Not with the escape plan. With the guard himself. The man was looking directly at the tunnel exit. Not scanning the perimeter. Not watching the compound. Looking at the exact spot where 76 prisoners planned to emerge. As if he'd been told. As if he'd been waiting. McBride's throat went dry. Betrayal was the simplest explanation. Someone had talked. Someone always talked. Torture, coercion, simple exhaustion. The methods didn't matter. The Gestapo were experts at extracting information. If they knew about Harry, they'd let it proceed this far to catch everyone involved. Maximum arrest. Maximum retribution. The alternative was worse. That the guard had discovered it himself. That he was waiting for orders. That armed men were already moving into position around the compound, preparing to shoot prisoners as they emerged. The Geneva Convention protected POWs from summary execution, but the Gestapo didn't answer to Geneva. And Hitler's recent directive regarding escaped prisoners was clear. Recaptured officers were to be handed to the Gestapo, not returned to camps. Behind McBride, the whispers grew more urgent. Men needed to know whether to proceed or abort. But aborting meant retreating through 300 feet of tunnel with 76 men, a logistical nightmare that could trigger panic, collapse, suffocation. Going forward meant trusting that one German guard, alone in the dark, staring at their exit point, wouldn't raise the alarm. McBride had flown 32 bombing missions over Germany. He'd watched men burn in aircraft fuselages, seen cities reduced to rubble, participated in the systematic destruction of a nation. He knew Germans as enemies, as targets, as the faceless mass responsible for a war that had killed millions. He did not know them as individuals who might choose silence over duty. The guard shifted his weight, reached into his coat pocket. McBride's heart hammered against the frozen earth. This was it. The man would pull a whistle, blow it, and the night would explode with searchlights and gunfire and screaming. Instead, the guard pulled out a cigarette, lit it with hands cupped against the wind. The match flare illuminated his face for a moment, young as McBride had guessed, unshaven, tired, the kind of tired that came from years, not hours. Then the guard turned, deliberately, slowly, turned his back to the tunnel exit and walked 5 paces toward the guard tower. Stood there, smoking, facing away from the forest, away from the escape route, leaving the path clear. McBride stared. The impossibility of it settled over him like physical weight. The guard knew, had to know, had positioned himself to see the exit, confirmed its location, then turned away, intentionally. "Green," McBride whispered. "We're going." The guard has his back turned. "We go now." The first man emerged from the tunnel at 10:47 p.m., according to watches synchronized with German camp time. He crossed the 15 feet to the tree line in 8 seconds, expecting a shout, a shot, an alarm. None came. The guard stood with his back to the forest, smoking. The second man followed. Then the third. The rhythm established itself. 1 man every 3 minutes, coordinated by signals passed back through the tunnel. Each emergence was an act of faith in something none of them understood. Each crossing seemed to take forever and no time at all. McBride went 15th. He crawled from the earth into air that shocked his lungs with cold. The moon painted everything silver and black, trees like iron bars, shadows like trenches. He could see the guard's back 20 yards away, could see the rifle slung over one shoulder, could see the steady rise and fall of breath. Then he was running. Low and fast and silent. The tree line swallowed him. He pressed against a pine trunk, breathing hard, staring back at the compound. The guard hadn't moved, hadn't turned, stood like a statue facing the wrong direction. Others emerged behind him. Green made it across. Then Pulowski, Van Weimersch, Bretel. One by one, ghosts escaping from underground, fleeing into a forest that stretched for miles in every direction. Each man carried forged papers, civilian clothes, compasses made from magnetized razor blades, maps drawn on handkerchiefs. Each man had memorized a story, a destination, a cover identity. None of them carried an explanation for the German guard who stood facing away from their escape, smoking cigarette after cigarette, making himself blind to what he had to know was happening behind him. By midnight, 76 men were out. 77 was halfway through when someone snagged the tunnel roof with a backpack. Dirt collapsed. The tunnel mouth partially caved. The man crawled back, signaling abort. No more would escape tonight. In the forest, the 76 scattered. McBride and Green moved west, following their planned route toward Czechoslovakia. They walked in silence for the first hour, putting distance between themselves and the camp. The forest was vast and dark and filled with the sound of wind in bare branches. Finally, Green spoke. "What was that guard doing?" "I don't know." "He saw us." "Yes." "And did nothing." "Yes." They walked another mile before McBride stopped. Turned back to look at the direction they'd come, though the camp was long invisible behind miles of trees. Maybe he was asleep. Standing up. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe. He turned his back deliberately, Green said. "I saw it too." He positioned himself to see the exit, then turned away. Why would he do that? Green had no answer. Neither did McBride. They had been trained to understand German military tactics, German aircraft, German strategy. They had not been trained to understand mercy from an enemy who, by all rights, should have considered them targets worth shooting. The question followed them through the forest. It would follow them through capture 3 days later, through interrogation, through the transport back to camp. It would follow them through the news that 50 of their fellow escapees had been shot by the Gestapo, not in escape attempts but in cold blood, in trucks and fields and quiet roadsides, murdered as punishment and warning. And it would follow them through the remainder of the war and the decades afterward, whenever they tried to reconcile what they'd witnessed that night. A German guard. A clear target. A simple duty to raise an alarm. And instead a turn back. A deliberate blindness. A choice made in silence that allowed 76 condemned men to walk into the dark. The full scope of what happened that night would not become clear until after the war. When archives opened. When survivors compared notes. When German records were examined and witnesses came forward, hesitant and haunted, to describe what they'd seen or participated in or chosen to ignore. The guard's name was Corporal Heinrich Müller. Not the Gestapo chief, a different Müller, one of thousands bearing that common surname. A farmer's son from outside Dresden, drafted in 1940, trained as a rifleman, sent to the Eastern Front in 1941. He'd witnessed Barbarossa's launch, had marched through burning villages, had seen things that changed the architecture of his thinking in ways that couldn't be undone. By 1943 he'd been wounded twice, shrapnel in the shoulder at Smolensk, frostbite requiring the amputation of 2 toes during the winter of '42. He'd been deemed unfit for frontline duty and reassigned to guard work. Stalag Luft III in Lower Silesia was considered a soft posting. Allied airmen. Officers. Men who, under the Geneva Convention, had to be treated according to specific rules. No torture. No execution without trial. No forced labor beyond camp maintenance. In theory it was civilized imprisonment. In practice it was still imprisonment. Guard duty was still guard duty. And Müller, standing watch on the night of March 24, 1944, still carried the weight of 3 years at war. What no one at Stalag Luft III knew, what wouldn't emerge until decades later, was that Müller had a brother. Younger by 3 years. A Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Yorkshire in 1942. Heinrich had received the telegram in December of that year, delivered to the Eastern Front. Missing in action. Presumed dead. He'd carried that telegram through the remainder of the winter campaign. Had kept it in his breast pocket when he was transferred to guard duty. Had unfolded and refolded so many times the creases had worn thin as tissue. Missing. Presumed. The words left room for hope and made that hope unbearable. His brother could be dead in a field somewhere, unburied and unmarked. Could be drowned in the North Sea. Could be held in some British prison camp, writing letters that never arrived, waiting for a war to end that showed no signs of ending. In February 1944, 2 months before the Great Escape, Müller had received a second letter. This one from the Red Cross. His brother was alive. Held at a British POW camp in Nottinghamshire. Uninjured. Being treated well. The letter included a photograph. His brother in RAF prison blues, thinner than remembered but smiling. On the back a message: "They are kind here. Hope you are safe. Franz." Müller had stared at that photograph for hours. Had tried to reconcile the word kind with what he knew of war. He'd been at Stalingrad, had seen what happened to prisoners there, both Russian and German. Starvation. Exposure. Summary execution. The word kind seemed to belong to a different language, a different universe. Yet there it was. Written in his brother's hand. They are kind. On the night of March 24th, Corporal Heinrich Müller was assigned to the North Perimeter Tower Watch. Standard duty. 4-hour rotation. The compound was quiet. Most prisoners were in their huts, the evening's roll call completed hours earlier. At 10:30 p.m., Müller noticed movement near the tree line. Subtle. A disturbance in snow that shouldn't have been there. He watched for several minutes, saw nothing more, but the unease persisted. He descended from the tower, walked the perimeter fence, examining the ground. What he found was fresh earth. Barely visible in the dark, but there, a scattering of yellow sand against white snow. The wrong color. The wrong texture. He crouched, touched it, understood immediately. Tunnel. His training was clear. Sound the alarm. Wake the camp commander. Trigger a lockdown. Capture the escapees as they emerged, preferably alive for interrogation, but if necessary, shoot on sight. Escaped prisoners attempting to flee German soil constituted a military threat. Regulations permitted use of lethal force. He stood there in the cold, hand on his whistle, looking at the yellow sand. They are kind here. His brother's words. Written from an enemy prison camp. Describing treatment that, by all accounts of German propaganda, shouldn't exist. The British were supposed to be brutal. Vengeful. The Americans worse. This was the narrative Müller had heard from officers, from radio broadcasts, from newsreels. Yet his brother, held by these enemies, was alive. Well-fed. Writing letters. Describing kindness. Müller walked back to his post. Stood in the position that gave him the clearest view of where the tunnel would emerge. Waited. At 10:47 p.m. he saw the first man crawl from the earth, saw him freeze, saw him realize he'd been seen. For 10 seconds they looked at each other across 20 yards of moonlit snow. Guard and prisoner. German and Englishman. 2 men in a war neither had started, neither could stop, meeting in a moment that required a decision. Müller thought of Franz. Thought of British guards standing watch over German prisoners. Thought of the word kind, and what it must have cost to write that word from captivity. Then he turned. Deliberately. Slowly. Turned his back and lit a cigarette. Gave the prisoner time to run. Gave the next prisoner the same. And the next. He stood there for an hour and 47 minutes. Long enough for 76 men to escape. Long enough to commit treason by any definition his superiors would recognize. Long enough to understand that he'd crossed a line from which there was no return. When the tunnel collapsed at midnight and the escape stopped, Müller returned to his tower. Filed his standard report at the end of his shift. Perimeter quiet. No incidents. The lie was simple to write. The weight of it was something else entirely. The discovery came at dawn. A guard making morning rounds saw footprints in the snow, tracked them to the tunnel mouth, raised the alarm. By 6 a.m. the camp was in lockdown. By 7 a.m., Gestapo teams were arriving from Breslau. By noon the interrogations had begun. Müller was questioned twice. Once by the camp commander, once by a Gestapo officer whose name Müller never learned. Both times he maintained his story. He'd patrolled the north perimeter at the assigned times, had seen nothing unusual, had filed accurate reports. The investigators were skeptical but had no evidence contradicting him. No prisoners had been caught near his position. The footprints all led away from the tunnel, not toward the guard tower. What saved Müller was the chaos of the investigation itself. With 76 prisoners loose across Germany, resources were diverted to recapture operations. The Gestapo cared more about hunting escapees than interrogating guards. Müller's mediocre service record, a wounded infantryman reassigned to garrison duty, made him unremarkable. He wasn't important enough to scrutinize closely. By March 26, recaptures had begun. The prisoners were caught in 2s and 3s on trains at border crossings, hiding in barns and forests. Most surrendered without resistance. They were cold, hungry, exhausted. The Gestapo took them into custody, loaded them into trucks, drove them away from the regular Wehrmacht units. On March 29, Müller was on duty when the first truck returned to Stalag Luft III. It should have held prisoners for return to the compound. Instead it held bodies. 50 of them, according to the manifest, shot while attempting escape. That was the official story. Müller saw the bodies unloaded. Saw the bullet wounds. Saw the hands that had been bound before execution. Saw everything that contradicted the official story and knew, with absolute certainty, what the Gestapo had done. 50 men murdered. Men he had allowed to escape. Men who might have lived if he'd sounded the alarm, if he'd kept them in captivity where the Geneva Convention still applied, where they were protected by international law from the Gestapo's reach. The weight of that realization nearly broke him. He'd thought he was choosing mercy. He'd thought he was reciprocating the kindness his brother described. Instead, he delivered 50 men to execution squads. That night, Müller wrote a letter to his brother. He never sent it, couldn't risk it being intercepted, couldn't bear to describe what he'd witnessed. But he wrote it anyway, the words a confession and a question. What is kindness worth in a war that turns it into murder? He kept that letter for the rest of his life. Carried it through the war's end, through the chaos of Germany's collapse, through the occupation and partition and decades of silence about what happened in those years. The paper yellowed. The ink faded. The question remained. The recapture operation stretched across a week. Of the 76 men who escaped, 73 were caught. 3 made it to safety, 2 reached Sweden, 1 made it to Spain via a network of resistance contacts. The other 73 were in Gestapo custody by April 6, 1944. On April 15, new orders arrived at Stalag Luft III from Berlin, signed by Hitler himself. 50 of the recaptured officers were to be shot as an example. Not returned to camp. Not court-martialed. Shot. The selection of which 50 was left to the Gestapo's discretion. Camp Commandant Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindner opposed the order. Argued it violated the Geneva Convention, would trigger Allied reprisals, accomplished nothing strategically. His objections were noted and ignored. The Wehrmacht no longer controlled prisoner policy. That authority had shifted to the SS and Gestapo. Von Lindner was allowed to see the orders but not to countermand them. The killings took place between March 29 and April 13. Small groups of prisoners were taken from trucks at remote locations, forest roads, empty fields, abandoned quarries. They were told they were being transferred to other camps. Some believed it. Others recognized the lie but had no means to resist. The execution method varied. Some were shot while standing. Others while sitting in trucks. A few tried to run and were killed in the back. The Gestapo documented each death with bureaucratic precision. Name, rank, serial number, time of death, location, cause. Shot while attempting to escape. The same phrase repeated 50 times. Among the dead were men Corporal Müller had watched escape. Flight Lieutenant Robert McBride. Squadron Leader Roger Bushell, the mastermind behind the tunnels. Flight Lieutenant Bernard Green. Men who had survived years of war only to die on German roadsides, executed for the crime of trying to return home. The bodies were cremated. Ashes returned to Stalag Luft III in 50 individual urns. The camp held a memorial service. The remaining prisoners stood in formation while the commandant read the names. Some wept. Others stood rigid with rage. All understood the message. Escape was no longer a military duty with military consequences. It was a death sentence. For Müller, the return of the urns marked the completion of a transformation he didn't want but couldn't undo. He tried to show mercy and created a massacre. Had tried to honor his brother's experience of kindness and instead delivered men to the Gestapo's brutality. The moral calculus of his choice inverted itself. The act that seemed right in the moment had produced consequences that were unequivocally wrong. He requested transfer. Was denied. Was told guard duty was essential service, that trained men were needed at the camp, that his record showed reliability. The irony of being praised for reliability, by superiors who didn't know he'd committed treason, added another layer to the weight he carried. Life in the camp continued. New prisoners arrived. Routine resumed. But the Great Escape and its aftermath had changed something fundamental in the relationship between guards and prisoners. The previous understanding, that both sides were soldiers doing their duty, bound by rules that transcended national loyalty, had been shattered. The The Gestapo's murders proved that some authorities in Germany no longer recognized those rules. And if the rules didn't apply, then every guard became complicit in a system that murdered prisoners for trying to escape. The British prisoners knew Müller's face. Had seen him on the North Perimeter Tower. Some suspected he'd been complicit in allowing the escape. The positioning was too perfect, the timing too convenient. But they had no proof. And if he had allowed it, what did that mean? That a German guard had shown mercy only to deliver them to execution? The thought was unbearable. Others believed he'd simply failed at his duty. Had been inattentive or incompetent, and the escape succeeded despite him rather than because of him. This was the simpler explanation. It required no moral complexity, no attempt to understand enemy humanity. Müller never clarified which version was true. Couldn't without confessing to treason. Couldn't without accepting responsibility for 50 deaths. So he remained silent, performed his duties, stood his watches, and carried the knowledge of what he'd done and what had resulted from it. In May 1944, Müller received another Red Cross letter from his brother. Franz wrote that he'd heard about the Stalag Luft III escape and executions. The news had reached British prison camps, carried by new prisoners whispered in barracks. Franz wrote, "I pray you weren't involved. I pray you weren't ordered to do anything that will haunt you. The British are still kind. I wish the same for prisoners in Germany." Müller folded the letter away with the first one. Couldn't bring himself to respond. What could he write? That he tried to match British kindness and created catastrophe? That mercy in war was a concept so fragile it shattered at the first touch of reality? The war ground on. Summer turned to autumn. Allied advances accelerated. The strategic situation deteriorated. By January 1945, Soviet forces were approaching from the east. Stalag Luft III was ordered evacuated. On January 27, in temperatures below zero, 10,000 prisoners began marching west. The Long March it would be called later. A forced evacuation through winter conditions with inadequate food, shelter, or medical care. Men died of exposure, dysentery, exhaustion. Guards and prisoners alike suffered, though prisoners bore the greater burden. Müller marched with his unit, guarding prisoners who could barely walk. He saw men collapse in snow. Saw others help them up. Saw the peculiar bond that formed between captor and captive when both were suffering together, when the real enemy became cold and hunger rather than each other. They reached Spremberg after a week. From there, prisoners were loaded onto trains to camps farther west. Müller's unit was reassigned to the Western Front. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. Units were being thrown into desperate defensive positions with no training, no equipment, no hope of victory. Müller fought in the Ruhr pocket. Surrendered to American forces in April 1945. Was held in a POW cage for 3 months, then released when his service record showed no SS or Gestapo affiliation. He returned to what remained of Dresden, which was to say rubble. His family's farm was gone, burned in the February 1945 firebombing. His parents were dead. He had no idea if his brother had survived. He spent the summer of 1945 searching. Red Cross lists, displaced persons camps, prisoner repatriation centers. In August, he found Franz's name on a list of Germans being processed for return from British custody. Alive. Unharmed. Being released. They reunited in September at a transit camp near Hanover. Franz looked older, thinner, tired. But alive. They embraced without words. What was there to say? The war was over. They both survived. The rest could wait. It took 3 days before Müller told his brother what he'd done at Stalag Luft III. Told him about the tunnel, the guard duty, the decision to turn away, the 50 murders that followed. Franz listened without interruption. When Müller finished, Franz was silent for a long time. Finally, "What would you have done differently?" "I don't know. If you'd raised the alarm, those men would still be in camp. Or transferred somewhere worse. Or killed in some other way. The Gestapo was hunting for excuses. So you chose the risk." "I chose wrong." Franz shook his head. "You chose what I experienced. What kept me alive. British guards who could have made our lives hell and chose not to. Who could have looked away when we were sick or cold or broken and chose to help. That's what you chose. The fact that the Gestapo murdered men afterward, that's not your choice. That's theirs." Müller wanted to believe him. Wanted to accept that distinction between his action and its consequences. But the 50 names remained. The urns returned to Stalag Luft III. The memorial service. The weight of knowing that men who ran into the forest that night had died because he'd given them the chance to run. "You can't carry their deaths," Franz said. "You didn't kill them. The Gestapo did. Your choice gave them a chance. Some made it. 3 out of 76. That's 3 men alive because you turned your back. And 50 dead. Who might have died anyway. Or lived in camps until the war ended, then gone home, then spent 60 years remembering that a German guard showed them mercy when he didn't have to. You don't get to know which outcome your choice prevented. You only know the one that happened. It was a generous interpretation. Too generous perhaps. But it gave Müller something to hold on to besides guilt. The possibility that his choice, however it had turned out, had been motivated by something worth preserving. That in a war designed to erase humanity he tried to honor it. That the effort mattered even when the result was horrific. The full truth about Corporal Heinrich Müller's role in the Great Escape wouldn't emerge for decades. He never spoke of it publicly. Never sought recognition or absolution. Went back to farming outside rebuilt Dresden, married, raised children, lived quietly through the Cold War division of Germany. But among the survivors, the 3 who made it to freedom and the 23 who were recaptured but not executed, stories circulated. Accounts that didn't quite match the official record. Memories of a guard who seemed to be looking away at exactly the right moment. Theories about what it meant. In 1963, squadron leader Bram van der Stok, one of the 3 successful escapees, published his memoir. He wrote about the escape with careful detail but noted something odd. The North Perimeter Guard seemed to have failed at his duty in ways that were almost too perfect to be accidental. Van der Stok didn't name Müller, didn't know his name, but described the incident with enough precision that anyone who'd been there would recognize the reference. The passage caught attention in Germany. A journalist tracked down Müller and asked for an interview. Müller declined. Declined again when approached by researchers. Declined when filmmakers wanted to include his story in documentaries. His silence was absolute. It wasn't until 1993, nearly 50 years after the escape, that his daughter found the letters. Both of them. The ones from Franz describing British kindness. The one Müller had written but never sent, describing his choice and its consequences. She read them, understood what they meant and asked her father if it was true. Did you let them escape? Müller, 74 years old by then, looked at his daughter for a long time. Finally, I don't know what I did. I stood watch. I saw nothing. That's what my report said. But you did see. What I saw and what I reported aren't the same thing. Why didn't you report what you saw? He showed her Franz's first letter. Pointed to the words, "They are kind here." Because of that. Because if the British were kind to your uncle, then maybe we should be kind to British prisoners. Because someone had to be. The interview that resulted, given to a German historian researching POW experiences, was Müller's only public statement on the matter. He described his duty that night. Described seeing the tunnel exit. Described his decision to turn away. And described the 50 murders that followed. I live with both, he said. The choice I made and what happened after. People want me to say I'd do it again, that I'd make the same choice knowing the outcome. I don't know if I would. But I know I couldn't have done differently at the time. That's not the same as saying it was right. It's just saying it was what happened. The interview was published in 1995 in a German academic journal. It received little attention in Germany. Post-war accounts of Wehrmacht service were common and often controversial, mixing genuine attempts at honesty with self-serving revisionism. But in Britain the RAF Museum took note. Reached out to surviving Great Escape prisoners for comment. The responses were mixed. Some refused to believe a German guard had deliberately allowed the escape. Others said that even if true, it didn't absolve German responsibility for the 50 murders. A few, very few, said that if the account was accurate, then Müller had tried to do something decent in circumstances that made decency nearly impossible. Charles Clark, one of the 23 who survived recapture, wrote a letter to Müller in 1996. Clark had been on the original escape list but was captured within 24 hours, interrogated by the Gestapo, held for 3 weeks, then returned to Stalag Luft III instead of being executed. Why he was spared when 50 others weren't remained unclear. Possibly random selection, possibly bureaucratic error, possibly intervention by someone in the system who balked at the murder count. Clark's letter was brief. I don't know if you're the guard who turned away that night. If you are, you should know that what followed wasn't your fault. The Gestapo made those choices. You made yours. I survived. Some didn't. That's war. Thank you for whatever decency you showed us, even if it couldn't prevent everything that came after. Müller never responded to Clark. But he kept the letter. It joined the others, Franz's Red Cross letters, his own unsent confession, his daughter's questions. Evidence of a moment in March 1944 when he tried to match kindness with kindness, and failed and succeeded, and couldn't know which outcome mattered more. He died in 1998 at age 79. His funeral was small, attended by family and a few neighbors. No military honors. No state recognition. He'd requested that specifically, had told his family he wanted no association with his Wehrmacht service. But 3 people attended who weren't family. British veterans who'd traveled to Dresden for the funeral. They didn't know Müller personally. Didn't know if he was the guard who'd turned away. But they knew the story. And they knew that in a war full of cruelty, someone had tried to show mercy. That the attempt had been imperfect and costly and complicated beyond moral resolution didn't make it worthless. After the funeral, one of the British veterans left a note at Müller's grave. It quoted from Clark's letter. Thank you for whatever decency you showed us, even if it couldn't prevent everything that came after. The note stayed there for weeks until weather degraded it. No one replaced it. No one needed to. The statement had been made. A gesture of recognition, not absolution. An acknowledgement that Müller's choice, whatever its outcomes, had been an attempt to preserve humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. Years later, in 2004, the RAF Museum in London opened an exhibit on the Great Escape. Among the artifacts was a photograph found in Müller's effects after his death. It showed the north perimeter of Stalag Luft III in winter. Snow on the ground. Guard tower visible. The tree line beyond. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would mean anything to most visitors. But for those who knew the story, the photograph was evidence of something that couldn't quite be called heroism but wasn't cowardice either. Evidence that even in total war, individual choices still mattered. That mercy, however imperfect, still had value. That the guard who turned his back had made a decision that echoed beyond his own life, beyond the war, into the complicated moral terrain where people had to live with what they'd done and what had resulted from it. The final artifact in Müller's collection, the unsent letter to his brother, asked a question that remained relevant long after both brothers were dead. What is kindness worth in a war that turns it into murder? The answer perhaps was this: kindness in war is worth exactly what it costs. The risk of being wrong. The risk of making things worse. The risk of trying to be human in circumstances that demand inhumanity. Müller paid that cost. So did the men who escaped because of him. So did the men who died. Whether the cost was worth paying depends on what you believe about moral choice in impossible circumstances. Whether individual acts of mercy matter when systemic cruelty dominates. Whether trying to do right has value independent of outcome. Müller never resolved those questions. Neither have the historians who study this period. Neither have the descendants of those who lived through it. The questions persist because they're not really about World War II specifically. They're about what humans owe each other when everything, law, state, military discipline, survival instinct, tells them they owe nothing. On March 24, 1944, a German guard stood watch over 76 men crawling from underground toward freedom. He could have stopped them. Should have, by military regulation. Instead he turned away. What followed was both catastrophic and redemptive. 50 deaths and 3 survivals. A massacre and a mercy. Both outcomes stemming from the same choice. The men who escaped couldn't believe who helped them. Not because of who he was, a German guard, an enemy soldier. But because he'd helped at all. Because in a war that reduced millions to numbers and targets, one person had seen individuals and acted accordingly. That he couldn't save them all doesn't make the attempt meaningless. That some died because of his choice doesn't erase the 3 who lived. Moral complexity doesn't resolve into simple lessons. It remains complex. Remains unresolved. Remains with us. Just as it remained with Heinrich Müller for 54 years after that March night. He carried it to his grave. But he wasn't the only one who carried it. The survivors carried it. The families of the 50 executed men carried it. The historians documenting the event carried it. Everyone who learns the story carries some weight of its moral ambiguity. Because at the heart of the story is a simple, terrible truth. In circumstances where every choice is wrong, choosing to show mercy might still be the least wrong option. Even when mercy fails. Even when kindness becomes complicit in killing. Even when the best you can offer is a turn back and a few minutes of deliberate blindness. The guard tower at Stalag Luft III's north perimeter was demolished after the war. The camp became a memorial site, then a museum. The tunnel exits were preserved under glass. The trees grew taller. The landscape changed. But the moment remains. Frozen in memory, in archived reports, in contradictory accounts and unresolved questions. A German guard and 76 Allied prisoners. A choice made in darkness. Consequences that still echo. They couldn't believe who helped them escape. Perhaps, in the end, that disbelief, that inability to reconcile enemy with helper, opponent with savior, guard with liberator, is the point. Perhaps the lesson isn't in the resolution but in the enduring question. What we owe each other. What mercy means. What kindness costs. What remains when the systems designed to turn humans into enemies briefly fail, and 2 people recognize each other across a divide wider than war. Heinrich Müller never answered these questions definitively. He couldn't. No one can. But he asked them with his life. And 76 men ran into the darkness because of that question, written in the deliberate turn of his back. Some died. Some lived. All carried the weight of that March night. As should we.